I'm Dermot Ryan. I've met many of you. I'm Dermot Ryan, the Director of Irish Studies here at Loyola and Marymount University. I want to welcome you to today's talk, given by our University Chancellor, Father Michael Engh, and entitled The Irish in LA, From Diaspora to Development. For those of us who are fortunate enough to work here at LMU, Father Engh needs little introduction. Mike was the Dean of this college, the Bellarmine College of Liberal Arts, and when I joined LMU in 2007, he actually interviewed me. We discussed Edmund Burke and Karl Marx, and I got the job. After serving as Dean, Mike, from 2009 to 2019, Mike served as the 28th President of Santa Clara University. Prior to his tenure as Dean here at BCLA and his time at Santa Clara, Mike was a professor of history here at LMU. A teacher and American historian, he has published many articles and works on the history of Los Angeles and the role of religion in the history of the American West. I'm so honored and so grateful he's agreed to speak to us today on the history of the Irish in LA. After his talk, Mike will join me and my colleague and fellow co-conspirator in all things Irish Studies, Professor Vicky Graff, for a panel discussion and an audience Q&A. On this Monday after St. Patrick's Day, it is fitting that we will hear about many Irish immigrants who left their native land to make a home here in Los Angeles. As Ireland's President Michael D. Higgins reminds us, Patrick himself was an immigrant. He was initially trafficked to Ireland and remained there as a slave for 6 years before escaping his captors and returning to his native Britain. He then did something remarkable, and yet also familiar to generations of Irish who consider him their patron saint. Patrick chose to leave his place of birth and make a new country, in his case Ireland, his adopted home. At the end of a weekend celebrating Ireland's patron saint, it is also wonderful to see so many friends of Ireland here today in the audience. I especially want to welcome those of you who are visiting LMU for the first time. I hope this afternoon's discussion will inspire you to attend future events here at our university. Particularly, I'd encourage you to keep an eye out for our programming to commemorate the 25th anniversary of the Good Friday Agreement, the peace accords which brought an end to the conflict in Northern Ireland. Irish Studies will be hosting a range of film screenings, panels, and talks, so stay tuned for more information on these events. I want to take a moment to acknowledge our many supporters who have made this event possible, and whose ongoing support ensures LMU is one of the centers of Irish Studies in Southern California. I want to recognize Provost Thomas Poon. Provost Poon, your presence here shows LMU's commitment to Irish Studies. After Father Engh's talk this afternoon, we'll have the opportunity to mingle over food, wine, and plenty of chilled Guinness, courtesy of the generosity of Robin Crabtree, the Dean of Bellarmine College of Liberal Arts, the college in which Irish Studies is housed. Robin has been a tireless supporter of Irish Studies. In the last month alone, she has met with the Secretary General of Ireland's Department of Foreign Affairs and a delegation from Queen's University Belfast, all in the interest of figuring out ways in which LMU and Ireland can work together and collaborate. I also want to thank the various organisations, including the Friendly Sons of St. Patrick and the Irish American Bar Association, who've generously and consistently supported Irish Studies. The President of the Irish American Bar Association is here today, Dave Manning. Thank you so much for your generosity and support. Finally, I want to acknowledge our partnership with the Irish Consulate here in Los Angeles and recognise that Irish Studies programming this year would not be possible without the extraordinary contribution of Ireland's Department of Foreign Affairs Immigration Support Programme. A programme whose goal is to strengthen the global Irish community and its bond with Ireland. In truth, our connection to the consulate and the current Consul General goes beyond the invaluable material support the consulate has offered Irish studies over the years. Those of us involved in Irish studies think of the consulate as enthusiastic partners and tireless supporters of the work we are doing. We view the consulate as our most significant collaborator, whose shared goal is to promote, support, and honour the Irish in Los Angeles and beyond, and tell the story of those Irish and Irish Americans, both past and present, who are part of the fabric of Los Angeles, this incredibly diverse and creative city we all are proud to call home. As a symbol of this spirit of partnership, I am honoured and very grateful to invite Marcella Smith, Consul General of Ireland, to the podium to offer some words of introduction.
Good afternoon, and thank you so much, Dermot, for those very generous words. And thank you, Chancellor Engh, Provost, Dean, Loyola Marymount University, for putting on today's events. As Dermot has said, the links between the Consul General of Ireland and the university are deep, they are strong. But it's not just the links that you have with us, it's also the links that you have fostered with the Irish community here in Los Angeles, with Ireland, and your work in spreading knowledge of Ireland, of our culture, our history, but also our present story through the Irish Studies programme, and as well as having regular events such as this. It's really deeply appreciated, so all thanks are due to you. You're actually doing a lot of my work for me, thank you very much. March has been declared Irish American Heritage Month by President Biden. So it is a month to celebrate the achievements and contributions of Irish Americans to the United States. Some 32 million Americans are claiming Irish heritage, including very proud Irishman President Biden himself. And some 2.5 million Californians claim Irish heritage, which makes the Golden State actually one of the greenest states in the US. So in the 1850s, when the seeds of giant redwood trees from Northern California were first carried across the Atlantic to be planted in Irish soil, at that time travelling in the opposite direction with the Irish ancestors of Californians. And the contribution of Ireland's people to the history and development of America, I think, is known well in the broadest sense, but less well known are many of the details of those contributions, particularly here in Los Angeles, where, as we'll learn, Irish people were involved in the development of almost every single aspect of cities' growth, from engineering to education, and even giving Hollywood its name. I don't know if you know the story of an Irish immigrant by the name of Matthew Girk, who travelled to California in the 1850s from Hollywood in Wicklow and named his homestead Hollywood, and it was around this homestead that the area grew while retaining the name. I'm not sure if the story is actually amongst those that you are going to share with us, Chancellor. You are, I know, a historian who actually deals in facts, and maybe there's not truth in that, but I tell it a lot. We will hear, though, of stories, histories that can be verified, of Irish people who looked to contribute to their community and work alongside LA's diverse community to help create this bustling, thriving city. And in addition, they brought with them their music, their stories, their dance, and helped create a shared love of our heritage and of our culture that helped build a solidarity across cultures to create ties and bonds that remain to this day. It was a real privilege for me to stand in City Hall on St. Patrick's Day and accept a certificate of recognition for our National Day, a certificate that recognises how our community has contributed to the city, but also how the city has really embraced our culture and our people. This St. Patrick's Day, Ireland was celebrating 100 years of active global engagement. And from the time of the foundation of our state, there really was a belief that Ireland should play a useful role on the global stage. And there was this really very fervent belief in the global preservation of peace, and that this could only be achieved by collective effort. And that concept of collective responsibility, it was one that we saw taken on by our diaspora as they played their parts in the communities that they joined. And I am so very pleased that Chancellor Engh is going to educate us now on how we did so here in Los Angeles. I know that that concept of collective responsibility runs deep in us all, and that our story here is not over. And understanding our history, it provides us with the tools for looking as to how we can build our collective futures in a really diverse, sensitive, respectful and inclusive way. So my many thanks to you, Chancellor. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marcella. It's a great honor to have you here, and it's great for me to learn something more about Hollywood history. I appreciate that very much. So, Your Honor, Marcella Smythe, our guests, all of our colleagues that are here today, when we think about immigration of the Irish to the United States, we often think about, it's New York, it's Boston, it's Chicago, maybe we think maybe even San Francisco, but we don't usually think about Los Angeles. And so the great stories of the great cities of the Eastern Seaboard and the Midwest have long claimed, because of large numbers, an Irish heritage which they contributed socially, politically, economically, and religiously. They made a dramatic impact on the country. But we can't overlook Los Angeles. And when we focus on LA, we've long recognized immigrants from Mexico, from Central and South America, from Eastern Europe, even Iranian Jews since the time of the Iranian Revolution. And by sheer numbers, we have to start by recognizing them, because by 1965, with the change in immigration laws, they were then followed then by huge numbers of people from the Philippines, from Chinese, Vietnamese, and other Southeast Asian peoples. And so in this great surge of population, the daughters and the sons of Ireland rarely get mentioned. And so if an Irishman hadn't conceived of the Los Angeles Aqueduct in 1902, 1906, we wouldn't have the city we have today, because we wouldn't have the water. And if we didn't have an Irish bishop in 1902 who conceived of Catholic schools and Catholic institutions, we wouldn't have the largest private educational system in the United States that the church has built here. So these are contributions of the Irish here to Los Angeles. So I'm going to focus on this overlooked immigrant group, and I'm going to address their impact without talking about the Irish Americans, okay? We could talk about Edward Doheny and the discovery of oil. We could talk about Walter O'Malley bringing the Dodgers here. We could talk about Francis Cordy starting Farmer John Meats. There's a lot of things we could talk about for Irish Americans. Tom Levy founding Farmers Insurance, Irene Dunn in the movie industry, lots and lots of Irish Americans. But today, I want to talk simply about the immigrants, those who left their country and came to this country. Just to keep us focused, and so we can get out in under an hour. Okay, so talk about the immigrants. There were relatively few in numbers in comparison to other groups, and yet my contention is that they yielded an impact far above their numbers. Okay, they punched above their weight, to use that phrase. And so, a few illustrations here. When the first Irish arrived in Los Angeles, this is a sketch from 1848, it wasn't much of a town. There were 1,600 people here at that time when the first Irish came. And what happened was, when the great gold rush began in the north of California, a few folks drifted down to the south. And it was hard to get to LA, because the prevailing winds were from the north. So if you were sailing in a ship, you got to sail against the wind. If you're going to travel then in a covered wagon, you got to get across the desert and across the mountains. Okay, so it was a very difficult town to get to. And so there was no natural harbor, and so the original settlers, or Spanish and Mexican settlers, engaged in ranching, cattle, and in farming. Very, very simple. And so what happened with the gold rush is all of a sudden there are thousands of miners coming from California, and they're hungry. And somebody has to supply the food, and so the the rancheros here began driving cattle north to feed the miners and sending food north as well. And so it got to be a pretty rowdy town because there was not a lot of money. And as some of the folks from the north drifted down to the south, they were not exactly exemplars of civic virtue. As one early minister said, you really ought to call this Los Diablos, not Los Angeles. So, among though the early arrivals was John Gately Downey. Downey was a young man who trained in Ireland, in Roscommon. He had trained as a chemist. And so when he got to LA, he opened a pharmacy. And from that pharmacy, he made enough money that he could loan it out. And he then drove a very hard bargain, had very high interest rates, and foreclosed on many a mortgage, and became a vast landowner. And as a vast landowner, he became an empowered Democratic politics. And in 1860, he's elected as Lieutenant Governor of California at age 32. Now, with the outbreak of the Civil War, the governor resigned and went to fight for the South. And so all of a sudden, John Downey from Los Angeles is now the new governor of California. So at this time, we have our first photograph of Los Angeles. If you were standing at the cathedral and looking out across the city, you'd be looking down to the plaza and then over towards East LA. And so Downey really was a very shrewd man. He married into a very prominent Mexican family, and he engaged in a great deal of investment, and he and friends founded a bank together. And we have an ad there for the Farmers and Merchants Bank of Los Angeles, John G. Downey and W. Hellman as the cashier. The two of them and another friend donated the land which now became USC. That came a few years later. So that was the beginnings of the USC. And then you notice a couple other names there, the Desmonds, who set up a hat store, and then Mr. McDonald opening then the Shamrock Restaurant. So those are the first of the businesses that we could track down that were of Irish background. Another of the people that came down from San Francisco was a gentleman by the name of Matthew Keller. Keller is very interesting. He's a graduate of Trinity College. He's a native of County Cork. He came to the gold rush. He was a merchant in San Francisco. And with his money, he came south and bought land. But he was interested in producing wine. And so he set out extensive vineyards. They say at one point 100,000 vines. And he was producing a whole range then of port, Madeira, Claret, Cherry, white wine, Angelica. And the Spanish named him Don Mateo. And he astounded the local inhabitants when Don Mateo paid 10 cents an acre for the Rancho Malibu. 13,000 acres at 10 cents an acre. He had the whole coast of the Malibu. His son later sold it at the astronomical amount of $10 an acre. So that land came and went to the family. One of their friends was this gentleman, Andrew Boyle. Andrew Boyle was from County Mayo. He immigrated to New York, and then to Texas, to an Irish colony, and then down to Mexico. And it was in Mexico that he met Mateo Keller. They later married two sisters in New Orleans, and then Keller followed the lure of gold to San Francisco. Boyle went after him and became a merchant there. He too came to Los Angeles in 1858, purchased a vineyard in lands on the east side of the LA River, which we would call East LA, and later his son subdivided that land and gave it the name of Boyle Heights, and that's still on our maps today. Boyle died in 1871. They both knew the sisters, the Daughters of Charity of St. Vincent de Paul, the first nuns that ever came to Los Angeles. The sisters came to set up an orphanage and a school, but pretty soon people were bringing them sick people. So they then said, well, there's probably a need then for some kind of medical facility. There were no hospitals in Los Angeles. And so the sisters eventually built the first hospital. They financed it with a you might say, a public-private partnership with the County of LA. And so the County of LA would help pay for patients, particularly the indigent. But then they thought the sisters were far too compassionate. And they really wanted the sisters running a poor farm. So they took the contract away from the sisters and set up a poor farm and made any of the indigent sick work if they wanted care. Sisters continued on, however, at their hospital, which was located in downtown LA, which was next to the Southern Pacific Railroad yards. And so many of the railroad workers, many of whom were Irish, ended up with the sisters. And it says the caption there that Anne and Nod Streets. Anne was named for Sister Anne Gillan. She was the first president, the first person to operate this hospital. And by 1870, we had 5 Irish nuns here working. That continued on as St. Vincent's Hospital, which only closed a few years ago. But that was the tradition that began there. Now, as the Irish began trickling in, laborers and others, we have some of the first advertisements showing up in the newspapers. They talk about lectures on behalf of Ireland in terms of to Ireland's struggle for independence. This is 1874. 1875, the St. Patrick's Day, the grandest ever given in Los Angeles, a parade and a grand ball. Among those supporting the grand ball were you see the Desmonds are there, but also the Hannans. And I want to make comment about the Hannans. Irish began coming into LA because land was being advertised. The railroads had come into LA, and first railroads out of the Pacific, and they began selling land on a massive scale, and fairly cheaply. And so this is what attracted people. You think back about Ireland, people who had been dispossessed from their land and the foreclosures. Here was a chance to get land and start over. And so one of the families, the Hannan family, shows up. Interesting, I'm using them as an example. Patrick Hannan was 17 years old when he left caring for America. He worked as a carpenter and eventually made enough money to come west. Again, the lure of gold, the lure of prosperity in California, but land. And so in 1874, he married another immigrant, Catherine Harnett. She came from Limerick. She'd first come to New York, and then she'd come to St. Louis to live with relatives, and then some of her relatives came to Los Angeles, and she joined them here. And so you have this, what they call chain migration, where somebody from the family comes first, and then others follow, and then sponsor them and support them. So that was going on. And they farmed 23 acres in what is now the industrial part of Los Angeles. Their children, they had 6 children. And what happened was after Patrick died in an accident on the farm, so his wife just added on to the house, and as each of her children got married, they moved in. So pretty soon all 6 children were living there with all of their children, so they had talked about the clan. They were all under one roof, at least for a while, as far as we know. Then their grandson, William Hannan, is the gentleman who became another land developer, and of course, he's the namesake of our Hannan Library here on campus, William H. Hannan. So very generous in that regard. Probably the most famous of the Irish in early Los Angeles is going to be William Mulholland. The name we've heard of in terms of Mulholland Drive. He's a gentleman born in Belfast. His family, his parents are actually from Dublin, so they moved back to Dublin. He was educated by the Irish Christian Brothers. And as his granddaughter told me once, they were so strict that he ran away to the sea. He enlisted in the British Merchant Marine. He sailed for 5 years and then jumped ship in New York. Worked his way across the country, followed relatives here to Los Angeles as a stowaway on a ship, and he arrived in 1877. So when he got here, he looked for a job. And at the time, Los Angeles was watered by ditches that ran through the city. In Spanish it's called zanja. And this provided the domestic water and then the irrigation water. So he was the deputy ditch manager, is what he did. Somebody had to keep track of the water flowing that went throughout the city. And so for 20 years, he walked every mile of that system of water distribution through the city. And then he got a very clear sense. There were dry years and there were wet years. Okay? In dry years, you turned to the artesian wells, and wet years, you drained your water off of the Los Angeles River. But he realized this was not going to go on forever. And so in 1902, we began making noise as the city is growing. This is downtown LA, looking at, what does it say? It's on Broadway at 2nd. The city's growing. There's 102,000 people in 1902. And we had traffic congestion even then. So I wish there was a film, because I want to know if that automobile ran into that wagon and worked or the streetcar. I mean, anyway, they hadn't quite developed any kind of traffic direction at that time. But Mulholland said you've got to have water. As the way he put it was, if you don't get the water, you won't need it. There won't be a city. And so he was hired by the original Department of Water. The city started that. And so the chief, as he became known, was a self-educated hydraulic engineer. As I said, he left school at age 15. He read vociferously, which gives us another clue in terms of the Irish contribution. That is his great level of knowledge. If you can't go to school, you still read widely. And so he understood hydraulics and built his system as a result. So between 1906 and 1912, they began then this construction of this project. Now, it's always highly controversial. Was Mulholland part of this great conspiracy to steal the water from the Owens River Valley? Part of the story is the city had bought up land in Owens River Valley, which is in eastern California, to get the water rights. But they didn't tell people that were selling the land for this land they wanted the water rights. And so when it came time to announce this, it was a huge shock to the people that had sold and to those that hadn't left yet, that all the water rights for the Owens River now were owned by Los Angeles. It was then Mulholland who designed the system to bring the water the 233 miles from the eastern Sierras down to Los Angeles. And he began a process then, first of all, digging canals to bring the water down. And he employed, at that point, 3,000 men. The project cost $24.36 million to build it. And he had an ingenious solution. He showed you the idea of the size of the pipe. But it's a gravity-fed water system. There are no pumps to bring the water over the mountains. So he created a siphon that sucked the water as it came down from the north, sucked it, and it flowed uphill on its own and then down again propelling water further. So, 6-year project, $24.6 million, on time and on budget. And this is the time of his greatest acclaim. People were saying, run for mayor, run for mayor. And his man, rather blunt opinion, he said, I'd rather give birth to a porcupine backwards than run for mayor of Los Angeles. So, he then is building this water system in Los Angeles, and the city goes then, it grows dramatically. By 1910, there's 300,000 people in Los Angeles, and by 1930, 1.2 million people. So there's incredible growth in population, which means an incredible thirst for more water. So Mulholland said the next place we have to draw water is the Colorado River. And that's his vision of building east a system. And that's the beginnings of what we call the Metropolitan Water District, which continues today. And our big fight today in terms of who gets the water from the Colorado River, which states have access to that. So all of this was going on until disaster hit. He had planned, one of the dams he had planned and built on the Santa Clara River, which is up in Ventura County, collapsed. He had built the dam too high, and it wasn't strong enough to hold the increased water by this increase in height. And the dam collapsed in 1928 and washed out in the middle of the night, and 400 people were swept away and died in that. And this great tragedy is one that he took full responsibility for. He thought he knew enough, but it was beyond his ability at that point. So he took full responsibility, and as he said at the coroner's inquest, with tears running down his face, "I envy the dead." And so it broke him, and he went into seclusion, so much so that his friends didn't want to associate or be seen with him. He resigned from his position in the Department of Water and Power, and his reputation was ruined. So in 1935, he died as a recluse. And the controversies about the LA aqueduct is continue. You want a more contemporary version of it? Patrick Hilton, yes, has made this documentary, Mulholland Drive, the history of the Los Angeles aqueduct, which is a great combination of history and humor. So, and it ends then, though, with a great sympathy for what the end of Mulholland's life. So I would recommend that to you. I found it really fascinating to watch. So, a couple examples of other Irishmen coming into town. Joe Scott was actually born in England, an English father, but his Irish mother was the one he worshipped. And so throughout his life, he championed the cause of Ireland. He championed Irish independence, and was a great presence in the city of Los Angeles. By the time he got here and passed the bar, he led the Board of Education for the city. He went on to the City Charter Revision Committee, and then he chaired the Chamber of Commerce. And it went on and on and on. He was involved in every civic activity you could think of. And he became then the one who introduced the Knights of Columbus to Southern California. And we think, well, the Knights of Columbus is a nice fraternal organization, and they do a lot of socializing, but actually it's the largest layperson's organization in the Catholic Church around the world. And it was Scott that introduced it here in Los Angeles. What's important about that is LA in the 1920s becomes a hotbed of the Ku Klux Klan. And the two great centers of the Ku Klux Klan were in Anaheim and in Inglewood. And so there was a strong anti-Catholic prejudice, anti-Irish prejudice, anti-Black prejudice. And Scott then was a great champion in defending the church. As I said, he was a great champion to the Irish. And here he is, he was welcoming Eamon de Valera from Ireland, then the first president of the Republic. Scott was an inveterate speaker. Every event that was possible, these are cuttings from his scrapbooks, which we have in our library. Again and again and again, he's championing the rights of the Irish. He's championing Irish independence. He's championing the cause of Irish, particularly at the time of the Civil War and the partition. He's at the forefront. Later, he becomes one of the nominators for Herbert Hoover in the 1928 Republican Convention. So, a major figure in the city, and has a statue in downtown LA where it says, Mr. Los Angeles, by the time he died in 1958. Now, while Mulholland and Scott were involved in these great projects that they were involved in, we then have to turn a moment then to a contemporary. This is the first Irish bishop of Los Angeles, Thomas Connolly. Our initial bishops in LA had been Spaniards and one short-term an American. But when Connolly arrived in 1902, he came here, he had been president of Catholic University in Washington, D.C. And he was a great proponent of education. Again, a great Irish trait. And so when he came here to Los Angeles, he began building schools and became deeply involved in not only in building schools, but founding parishes, building churches, and he joined the LA Chamber of Commerce. So he became a city booster extraordinaire. So you have prelate of the church in the Chamber of Commerce. I should mention he was born in County Cavan, but raised in the United States. And because of him, he pressured the Jesuits into coming into Los Angeles, even though the Jesuits didn't have the manpower at the time. He put enough pressure on them that we indeed opened a school in 1911, which we call Los Angeles College, but we now know as Loyola Marymount University, as well as Loyola High School. So those are both results of Connolly's leadership. He also began a process of recruiting priests and seminarians from Ireland. And up to this point, in the early priests, a few of them had drifted in from Ireland, but most of the priests had come from Spain. And so when he got here, Conady found 100 priests, and in his recruiting, he brought in 290 more. So by the time of his death, he'd become the model of the 20th century bishop as a pastor, a builder, civic leader, and an administrator. So he set the pattern that was followed then by the next Irish bishop, which was a gentleman by the name of John J. Cantwell. Cantwell, from Limerick, had originally come to San Francisco to be a priest there, but was recruited. Nobody wanted to be bishop of Los Angeles. So it took them 2 years to find somebody who would take over the city, which was then largely Protestant. And it wasn't, and the church was relatively poor. So if you were in San Francisco or Baltimore or New York or some other great city, did you really want to come to LA? And gradually they talked John Campbell into coming down, and he began then 35 years as the bishop here. And his, I guess, the thing that really stood out for me was his Irish sensibility in terms about morality. He was much concerned about the movie industry. He had a very dim view then of so many of the Jewish studio heads, and he began looking for ways to get the movie industry to improve the content of its films. So he first recruited Amedeo Giannini, who was the chair of the Bank of America. Giannini was a pioneer in financing the making of movies. And so Campbell, enlisting Giannini, to put pressure on the movie studios to produce better films, better quality films. And when that didn't work, he then turned to the American bishops, and he said, look, 84% of all the movies being produced in the United States are coming out of Los Angeles and Hollywood. So he felt, as the bishop of Los Angeles, he had a responsibility to make sure the movies were improved. So he recruited the bishops to do something about it. They founded what was called the National Legion of Decency. I grew up reading the publication, the monthly publication of the Legion of Decency, because they rated the movies, and maybe some of you remember that as well. Movies were A, if they were morally acceptable, B, if they were partially acceptable, and C, if they were condemned. Okay? And just to make sure that, that this was an effective tool, the bishops devised a pledge that was sent to all the parishes in the United States, where Catholics were asked on a Sunday to stand up and pledge they would not go to morally unacceptable movies. Okay? Maybe a B movie, but certainly not a C. And so what Cantwell did was then he recruited another Irishman, Father John Devlin from County Cork. He was a Cork man. He was the liaison to the movie industry. And so whenever there was an issue about would this movie pass the censors or an improvement of the approval of the Legion of Decency, the cry was, get Father Devlin. And so what Devlin did, and each of the bishops across the country eventually worked out a system for this, they had a group of women who were college alumni who previewed the movies. And eventually it was centered in New York City. And they watched thousands of movies. And they rated them and sent that out, and then the bishops then promoted that. So this went in conjunction with, Joseph Green. The movie industry itself had tried to regulate the moral content of the film to get the bishops off their back. And so the Motion Picture Producers and Distributors of America hired Green to run the Production Code Administration. So he reviewed the movies on behalf of the studios in conjunction with the pressure we got from the Catholic Church through Father Devlin and Campbell. And so he then was the one who gave the seal of approval. This picture approved. Okay? And that was made part of the film that people saw that knew this was being approved. Well, you find out in the 1930s, and there's a whole slew of movies about Catholic priests and Catholic nuns, going my way, the Bells of St. Mary. And people began complaining about, what is this? Is this promotion through the Catholic Church? What's happening here? But they were trying to make sure that this, that there was an improvement in what was being shown. So they did. Green made sure there were not complimentary depictions of divorce, no. Premarital sex, no. Drug use, no. Brutality, blasphemy, disrespect for authority, all of these things were subject to review. And so then the films, as they call them rushes, the first editions of the films, had to be cut and spliced if they didn't get approval. So, we could do a whole talk just on the history of the Irish in Hollywood. And this would go on. We'd probably start with William Desmond Taylor from Carlow, who died in 1922, in a very famous murder mystery. Then Maureen O'Hara from Dublin, as they say, the Queen of Technicolor, because as Technicolor came in, eyes and hair, it looked really good. And then Barry Fitzgerald, also from Dublin, who was in the classic movie Going My Way. If you remember that movie, there's the doddering little pastor, Father Fitzgibbon, and then Bing Crosby comes in to revive the parish. Well, the doddering little pastor was modeled on Monsignor Nicholas Keneally over at St. Monica's Church here in Santa Monica. And Keneally himself was a great character. Remember one story they told that a policeman stopped Keneally when he was driving and gave him a ticket. And Keneally contested, I was signaling to make my left-hand turn. And he took it to court. And the judge heard the case, and the judge said, wait a minute, you're saying Father Keneally didn't have his hand out for the left hand? Why did his hand out, And then we could go on from there. There's, Stephen Boyd, the Glenn Gormley boy, and others that, as I said, a whole other talk we could do. Now, when Cantwell wasn't worried about the movies, he was also concerned about education. And he's seated here at the graduation of Marymount High School and College in the late 1940s. He had invited the religious of the Sacred Heart of Mary in the 1920s to come to the school. The religious of the Sacred Heart of Mary, which I'm going to call the RSHMs for short, came from Tarrytown, New York, and Mother Marie Joseph Butler from Kilkenny was the head of the Superior General there. She sent the first 5 nuns here to Los Angeles. They rented an old estate which is near USC, and it's presently that building is now the USC sorority house. You probably never knew there were nuns living in that house. That's where the school began. And they started at the primary school, and they went to secondary, then they went on to college education. So, the RSHMs and so many other religious orders of women had recruited young women to come west, to join the orders and then to come west to the United States. And Marymount High School today is, by UCLA, continues on their educational tradition. They also they split and became then a college. And on the left is Sister Raymond McKay, and on the right is Sister Gertrude Kane. Mother Raymond, as she was known when she first came here, was a native of Belfast, graduate of the London School of Economics, earned a doctorate at Fordham. She had led Marymount Manhattan, and she was sent here in 1959 because the Marymount College wasn't doing well. And she looked at the book, she looked at the location, she looked at the future, and she said, coeducation is on the horizon. And a separate all-women's college doesn't make sense anymore. So she went to the Cardinal at the time, James Francis Cardinal McIntyre, Archbishop of Los Angeles, and she talked about, could we merge or affiliate with, first of all, could we admit men? And he said, absolutely not. Men and women should not be educated together. Terrible idea. And so then she said, well, could we affiliate with Loyola University of Los Angeles, which is all male? And he said, absolutely not. And then she said, what if we had co-instruction? Oh, that's not co-education. So when she called up the president of Loyola, Father Cassatt, Charles Cassatt, and said, he's approved, he didn't believe it. But they avoided the word co-education, and the word was co-destruction. And so she was the one that made this possible for the Marymount to move here, and eventually they will merge. At the time, and I'll put the, let's go back. The President Casassa, at the time, they were the ones that engineered the affiliation, and then later on the then came back to the merger. Just a couple of examples of women who came with their RSHMs. I had a chance to interview one of the women in this, two of the women in this slide. Sister Evelyn Joyce grew up in a cottage in County Galway, and when she was in the 6th grade, recruiting nuns came through to invite 6th grade graduating girls to come to Paris to study with the RSHMs in Paris, to get a high school diploma and possibly join the order. And so Evelyn and her friend, Joan Tracy from the village of Lachine in County Galway, both accepted, went to Paris. This is their graduating class in Paris. You see the sisters standing in the back, their faculty. You can see why they were called the parenthesis sisters. And so the two of them decided, we will join the order. And so they booked passage, the sisters booked passage for them on the SS Mauritania. They sailed from New York, they went to Tarrytown, New York, and joined the convent there. While there, they began college studies, and then they were both assigned to go teach in Los Angeles. Okay? And so now Sister Evelyn, standing there on the far right, arrived at St. Alphonsus Parish in East Los Angeles for a class of 55 second graders, while Sister Joan went to another school and had 55 third graders out in the San Fernando Valley. And so this was, then they finished their bachelor's degrees by going to summer school. That's the way it went in those days. Very, very, very common at the time that the sisters were educated that way. I mentioned about them being recruited to come and teach here because the Archbishop of Los Angeles, James Francis Cardinal McIntyre, in the first 15 years that he was Archbishop, he was opening a new school every month. And for these new schools every month, he needed teachers. And so the sisters then were being recruited from Ireland in great numbers. And he was using his assistant bishop, Timothy, who was from Cork, to recruit and who knew many of the religious orders. And then one of which was the Sisters of St. Louis. It's a rather distinctive habit. some very fine educators, and one of them was, this is 1949, they're on board the ship, they're sailing to New York to make their trip to Los Angeles. They've been recruited to come here to teach. $50 a month was their salary per sister. No medical benefits, no retirement benefits. It was just, they were going to make the sacrifice to come forward to do this. And so, by 1965, we look across the United States as a whole, there's 104,000 nuns teaching in the Catholic schools, and there's 113,000 Catholic elementary schools. It's the largest private educational system in the world, and it's built on the sisters. One of them, not pictured in this group, is Sister Joanne Conran, Sisters of St. Louis. She came here later. She had originally volunteered for Africa when it was time for assignment. And they said, well, we really need you more in Corpus Christi Parish in Pacific Palisades, Los Angeles. So no Africa for her, and she came here. She later earned her master's degree and then worked in our Office of Student Counseling, worked here for 22 years. And so I could go on for a number of examples of sisters who came west. Another order, Daughters of Mary and Joseph, Sister Stella Marie. 48 years as teacher and principal at St. Paul's School in Westwood, making that a very fine school. And then Sister Edith Prendergast, the Religious Sisters of Charity. I once asked the sisters, is this the Sisters of Charity, the Sisters of Mercy? And they said, oh, there's no mercy here. So, Edith was hired as an educator, religious educator, And then for 27 years, she ran the religious education office of the Archdiocese of Los Angeles and their annual congress to train religious educators. Okay, when she stepped down, the Religious Ed Congress attracted 40,000 religious educators. It was the largest such gathering in the Catholic world, all under her leadership. So we could go on quite a bit about the sisters. I'd like one last word about the priests before I wrap up. As I said, Bishop Connerty had begun recruiting priests, but after a while they didn't have to worry about that because there were so many Irish here that their uncles and their brothers and their cousins back in Ireland wanted to come to Los Angeles. So they didn't have to recruit, the guys were volunteering. So I interviewed Monsignor Clem Connolly, who retired pastor in South Pasadena. He said he was going to St. Patrick's in Thurles in Tipperary, and he originally was volunteering for Natchez, Mississippi. Some bishop came through from Natchez with recruiting seminarians, and they got a phone call, and back to Bishop Manning, saying, "I've met this young man, I'd like him to come to Los Angeles." And so the superiors there, the seminary said, "It's not going to be Natchez, it's going to be Los Angeles." And he said, "Whatever." He thought he was going to be going elsewhere, but he came to Los Angeles. So it's part of this international network of Irish clergy here in Los Angeles, but in other parts of the world, like Australia as well. Personal contacts about men who come. And then the last one, the last example, of course, is the most famous one in the last several weeks, Bishop O'Connell. He too, County Cork, educated in Ireland, ordained for Los Angeles, came here, worked in inner city parishes, learned Spanish, was a great advocate for the poor, which is a very strong passion among people who have known suffering to pay attention to those who are also suffering presently. And so it was a huge loss when he was killed a couple of weeks ago. Famous for his humor. I could actually stop and tell a few jokes now, but he was a great one for sense of humor. So let me close. Let me just wrap this up so we have time for a few questions. In the 1980s, in the 1990s, the Irish home economy changed. There was a great deal of investment that went on because here was a highly educated people, and so companies began investing in Ireland in sizable numbers. And so what we have is the beginning of return to Ireland. Irish immigrants going back. And then as social media continues on, with Skype and other things, it's a lot easier to keep in contact with families back in Ireland. And so you have then the beginnings of migration back and forth. The Irish government began to recognize that to make it easier for that. So between 2008, 2015, the Irish government adopted policies that acknowledged this two-way flow of their citizens, making it easier for people to come back and forth. Some would call them the transatlantics, this new generation of Irish going back and forth. But I want to close with that because when we get to the Irish today, I want to point out where we find the Irish active in entertainment and technology today. And I got to thank Des Carey, who's here today, for helping me put together this just a sampling of the way the Irish have made an impact in entertainment and technology. Okay? As you noted in the last Academy Awards, 25% of all the nominees were Irish or Irish productions. Okay? They didn't come home with the Oscars, but anyway, they were nominated. So we've got a great sampling of those who are here now contributing to Los Angeles. So I want to close then. 2019, I would say that the Irish consulate was established here. We have the consul general present with us today. And I want to make a couple of comments. One is the talent that Ireland exported was due to the educational system that was built up there. Okay? And this passion for education we've seen again and again through the bishops, the priests, the sisters that came here, the schools they founded and staffed. Extremely important then for the building up of our city. For the economy, then you see these other great exemplars of how the Irish affect our economy today. And so we're a long way from John Downey and Bill Mulholland or Bishop Conady and the Irish Sisters, but there's this outsized impact on our civic culture, our religious culture, and the social fabric of the city. And so the Irish may not be great in numbers, but if you're going to understand Los Angeles, you have to understand that there are these strains of population that are extremely, extremely important for who we are as a diverse society. The people of the world make up our city, but the Irish contribute in a very significant way. So with that, go Ireland.
Well, Chancellor Engh, it is a real privilege to have you present with us, and it was fascinating, but I know when Dermot was introducing you, you've worn many titles and so forth, but I think your passion is as a historian. I mean, that's sort of how this all began for you. So I'm curious because as it's been noted, there really hasn't been a lot of recognition in terms of the contribution of the Irish in Los Angeles. So how did you conduct your research? How did you made some comments about some of the interviews that you had, but I would imagine in finding the documents and articles, I'm just curious, and there may be some people in the audience you might want to follow up with what you've been able to bring to us today. So how did you conduct your research?
It was unending. Some of this I knew, some of the people I had heard of before, and like Andrew Boyle, Boyle Heights, I knew about him. I knew about Bill Mulholland. Mulholland's granddaughter used to lecture in my class on LA history, because I taught a class on the history of LA. So I knew some of this by background. And then others I just had to keep digging. You know, I didn't know anything about Maureen O'Hara. Now I have to read her autobiography to learn even more. But there are just names led to names led to names. So that's what it was. Simple.
But how about the LA libraries and so forth? I mean, I would imagine, did you go to the Huntington? Did you go to the LA library? How did you conduct the actual research to get some of the pictures and articles?
I relied exclusively on the LMU library and the archives and special collections, and then my own collection of books. I just didn't have time to go to the Huntington Library. I have a full-time job, so I didn't have much other time for that. Thanks.
Mike, one thing I was thinking about when I was listening to your talk was about the Irish and LMU. You touched on that somewhat, but was there, in the past, were there like a large number of Irish faculty? Were there Irish priests teaching here? Did it have an Irish flavor in previous years?
What we had here were Irish Americans. The school was, the first presidents there's a string of Irish American presidents that were here. The major impact that came, though, was with the Religions of the Sacred Heart of Mary. So many of the sisters were from Ireland, like Mother McKay and others that came here. They had an impact in terms of the education. And the reason I might point that out is that Raymond McKay did not believe that women should be simply given a convent education in the fine arts and, you know, make good wives and that's it. She strongly, strongly believed that women had a place to play in the world, in business, in government, in commerce. She was a strong advocate for it. And so that's the impact here at Loyola Marymount that she brings, because they had to merge then the Marymount College with Loyola, which the men outnumbered the women in those days, until now the women now it's more or less at parity. But in the early years, she had to push very strongly that women be treated equally to men. And that was the major Irish impact, and it was on the education of women. Yeah.
We have just a couple of more questions ourselves, and then we'll open it up to the audience. So please get your questions ready for Father Engh. But you touched on this a little bit in your presentation about some of the discrimination that went on in Los Angeles. And, you know, we've heard, you know, in terms of Boston and so forth, Irish need not apply, and some of the anti-Irish initiatives and so forth. Did that exist here in Los Angeles, or was it just part of the larger issue of discrimination and so forth that went on?
The issue of discrimination came about really as the city grew, and we had, In 1900 and 1920, there's enormous influx of people. The city grows to over 1,200,000 people. Many were from the American Midwest and South. So there was not a Catholic population that was moving into the city. And the anti-Irish prejudice ran deep at that time, but the numbers weren't great. So there wasn't the threat they felt elsewhere. But people like Joe Scott made sure that any slight of the Irish was going to be challenged. And he sued the LA Times at one point and won because they had put down the Irish. It's a very famous case, but I won't go into the details of it. But Scott was not going to put up with any second-class treatment of the Irish. What I would have to say, discrimination went both ways. And Cantwell and some of the letters that I read about the Jewish studio heads were pretty negative, and a lot of stereotypes about Jews just out to make money. And so that was another strain. I didn't go into that in any length, but as Hitler comes to power, then Cantwell begins changing his tune in terms of sympathy for the Jewish community. He develops a strong relationship with a chief rabbi at Wilshire Boulevard Temple, Rabbi Edgar Magnin, who was the rabbi to the stars, okay? And so that then began to mitigate some of the previous pretty nasty language that when Joe Breen and he exchanged in their letters. So it went both ways.
Yeah, Mike, I was kind of want to develop that question. When we think about New York, think about Boston, we think about the incredible contributions the Irish made to those cities, but we also have to kind of grapple, those of us who are proud of our heritage, have to grapple with the fact of the Irish contribution to racial tensions or racial violence. And historically, I was thinking about the draft riots, large participation of the Irish when Harlem gets attacked, and then the anti-busing demonstrations in Boston is another example. In your research, did you find any evidence of Irish or Irish American animus to other ethnicities in the city?
That's a good question too, because the provost asked me this question earlier today. We were talking about the Irish who were adamantly opposed to the Chinese in San Francisco. So it was the working class Irish versus the working class Chinese. Very strong animus up in San Francisco, 1879 onward. We don't see that here in Los Angeles because there aren't that many Irish here, okay? If there is the competition, if there is the animus, it's not recorded in the way it was in San Francisco. In the San Francisco, it was carried in the newspapers. And they had a very prominent priest denouncing the Chinese. The Chinese must go was the phrase. We didn't see that here in LA. We just, for whatever reason, we don't see it. Now, was it there? There could well have been those kind of sentiments, yeah. But I don't know that for here, because the numbers were so different, yeah.
Okay, I'm going to run around some mics. We'd like to open up for a Q&A. If anybody's got a question for Mike, raise your hand and I'll bring the mic to you. Okay.
This might be out of your wheelhouse, but you must have an opinion on Ireland was the most Catholic country in Europe.
Could I turn to the Consul General for that one? Actually, it's really interesting. Several years ago, I was in Ireland. I was doing research in the National Archives because, like most everybody, I had some relatives who were from Ireland, and I wanted to track down whatever I could. So I was working in the National Archives, and one day I took a taxi out to Phoenix Park, where the great Center for Maps are for the government, and the taxi driver gave me a whole lecture on the abuses of the Catholic Church in political power in the history of Ireland. And it was very obvious to me that if he had once been devout, he wasn't anymore, And so it raises a whole question, and it is out of my wheelhouse, but there has been a tremendous shift. Yes, that's true. There has been antagonism against the church, which was very powerful in the city, in the country, and particularly on matters of morality. You know, divorce and abortion; those have been very highly controversial. And can I just stop with that? Massive change, right? Yes.
National identity.
And I'd say if we had somebody from the political science and international relations department, they would say there's a similar dynamic going on in Poland, which was an intensely Catholic country, and yet there's a huge shifts going on in terms of beliefs and attitudes. And then the uncovering, as you said, of the scandals as well. So it has an impact. Yeah.
Any further questions from Michael?
One thing that fascinates me about history and national pride is uh, when acceptance of mixed race heritage comes in. Did you find any evidence of that in your research in LA and Irish pride in Irish and also potentially acceptance of mixed race Irish in LA?
That's a very interesting question. There was a graduate of this institution, Dan Marshall, who became an attorney, who argued the first case that the state Supreme Court struck down the laws against interracial marriage. And and because California law forbade interracial marriage until 1948 or so. But Marshall argued his interesting angle that he's Irish American, okay, so he's not Irish, he's Irish American. He argued that the law prohibited Catholics from enjoying the sacrament of matrimony if they were mixed race, and they couldn't get around that. They said, yeah, that's right. It's interference in freedom of religion. That's what led to the end of that. So it was an Irish American that argued the case. It doesn't mean that all the Irish or the Irish Americans were in favor of that, but there was a sensitivity around the issue that led him to argue that case. Yeah, yeah, it's the best I can do. I'm sorry. Yeah. I said, Des, you had your hand up. There was an organization here called the Silver Shirts, and it was a pro-Nazi organization that recruited people to support the Nazi rise in Germany. So they were active here in the 1930s. I don't know anything about, they say the Catholic or the Irish connection with that. I know the organization existed, and that's been well documented. I just don't know much more than that it existed. I do know that gradually you'll start seeing in the Catholic newspaper which was then called the Tidings, editorials pointing out what was happening in Germany as being anti-Catholic, okay? And anti-Catholic, and then what about anti-Jewish, okay? So there is the beginning of that, and I've only done slight research on that, so I really can't comment much more than that. It's a great topic, though. It really is an interesting one, because Cantwell had to shift his attitude in terms of the Jews in Los Angeles, the Jewish population in Los Angeles, and then what was happening in Germany, because they were hearing about it. I mean, the news was coming out, 33, 34, 35, what Hitler was doing. People knew what was happening. So if it's a topic worth exploring. So maybe with that, we could adjourn and have a good drink and talk some more.
Yes, let's give Father Mike Engh a round of applause.